Happy New Year, and welcome back to Desert Lady Diaries podcast, a weekly conversation with women who found their home in the Mojave Desert. I'm your host, Dawn Davis, and this is episode number 21. If you're listening for the first time, welcome, and if you're a returning listener, thanks so much for coming back. And if you want more Desert Lady Diaries than just the podcast, we have a website, desertladydiaries.com. We have a Facebook page, Desert Lady Diaries, or you can follow us on Instagram. I'm spending a lot of time this week ramping things back up and getting ready to get some amazing women on the podcast. And I want to first thank listener Rachel Eichhorn for her extremely generous donation. I'm going to start researching to purchase some new microphones to use for the podcast, and that donation will likely cover the cost of those microphones completely. So Rachel, really, thank you so much for that. If you're enjoying the podcast and would like to donate toward items like the podcast hosting site, the SoundCloud Premium membership, or the website or domain, you can go to the website desertladydiaries.com and you'll see a donate button in the upper right-hand corner. This week's guests are no longer living, but during their day, they each had some impact here in the Mojave. Helen Bagley and her husband Frank came to 29 Palms in 1927 and opened a grocery store. And Minerva Hoyt just about single-handedly persuaded the U.S. government to preserve desert land that we now know as Joshua Tree National Park. Big thanks to Mike Stillman for introducing me to Helen Bagley's book, Sand in My Shoe, and to Minerva's story in The National Parks and the Women's Voice, A History by Polly Welts Kaufman. The episode is a bit longer than 30 minutes today, but I think you'll enjoy these two excerpts. We saw 29 Palms in the spring of 1927. We had driven from the highway at Whitewater across a single-track road which dodged Joshua trees, boulders, even greasewood bushes. When we chose the site for our homestead and store a few months later, we reached it across untracked sand. There was not even a mile of straight road. More important, there was no school, post office, or store. The Gold Park Hotel, then east of the Oasis of Mara, sold groceries from its stock when they could be spared, and gasoline to homesteaders who had run out. No group of buildings could be called a village. A population from 50 to 100 persons was scattered from Yucca Valley to the Dale Mining District, and from the Dry Lake to the Oasis. There was a cattle ranch near Yucca Valley and a few prospectors in the hills. Most of the settlers were homesteaders, and many of them were veterans of World War I. It was a frontier community. My husband, Frank, had heard of the settlement in 29 Palms through other veterans in Pasadena. For several years, he had been having asthma. In the fall of 1927, desperate from ill health, he decided to move to the desert. He filed on a homestead and put up our first building, designed for a double garage. In November, he brought the family out. John, our eldest son, was 6, Alan 3, and Denny only 4 months old. We had promised ourselves that although the desert might hold some hardships, we would enjoy a sense of limitless space, quiet, and peace. We were to find that these are not easily realized in a double garage with 3 children and a grocery store. My first impression of my new home was of the kindness of my neighbors and not of loneliness. Jim Byler, who lived on a homestead a mile from ours, our next-door neighbor by desert standard, had driven our pickup from Pasadena with furniture, while Frank followed with the family. During the hour by which Jim had preceded us, he had managed to unload, put our rug on the floor, and set up our beds, giving the place a somewhat look of a home. I put the baby down from aching arms and thanked him. He grunted, glanced from me to my old bureau with its large mirror, and said shortly, "You fixin' to be a lady?" He strode out. Jim had been in the American Expeditionary Force at 16 and in and out of hospitals ever since. He tried hard, but not quite successfully, to live down a family background of gentle ways. Our building had been intended only as a garage. It had a cement floor and apron in front, was lined with black building paper, unfinished as to beams and ceiling, and had been our plan to have a small house with a large front room to be used as a store, an arrangement common then in any rural community. But the truck and the garage had cost more than we expected, and the right of entry on our land was clouded by a previous lease. We had not much money left from doctor bills, and so we decided to move into the garage building and wait for the store. We could at least set up a gas pump and enjoy whatever business and income that might bring us. Frank hired Bill Smith to help him. Bill was round-shouldered with the walk of one who followed the plow too early. He had accidentally come to the desert and remained to homestead. He intended to farm someday. There was no hurry. The single gas pump had placed in position near the corner of our garage house. 2 men, using a hand mixer, were about to mix the cement for the foundation when a woman drove up in an old Packard car. "Bill," she drawled in a soft Southern voice, "you promised to locate me a homestead. I want you should come with me now." Bill sat back on his heels and considered. "Well, I sort of hired out to Frank to set this here pump." "I certainly never yet saw any homesteader in a hurry." Bill considered. Certainly in the 50 miles of desert we could see from our hill, there was no line of cars waiting for a service station. He climbed into the Packard. "I might accidentally get back tonight," he reassured us. It was a 2-man job. I had been watching with the baby in my arms. I carried him to his bed in the building. "I can turn the mixer while you pour," I said. Then Bob McCown came along. McCown was a lunger who had left the terminal ward of a veterans hospital by the front door because he, and everyone else, was tired of waiting for him to leave by the back. The 3 of us set the pump. It was Thanksgiving Day. We had boiled beans and canned spinach for dinner, but we were grateful. We had made a beginning. Our garage house seemed well occupied with the 5 of us living in it. The right-hand side of the room was our kitchen. There was a long table with a window and 2 shelves for groceries above it. Our stove was a 2-burner gasoline camp stove, later replaced by a little wood range in the corner. At the back was a single bed in which the 2 boys slept end to end. This was not a congenial arrangement. The cry, "Mama, Johnny's touching me," came to be a byword in our family. The baby slept in his carriage. The corner was curtained with black, brightly flowered chintz, and beside it stood the old bureau with the large mirror to which Jim Byler had objected. Our top drawer held the office equipment for the gas station. The cash was kept in a cigar box. When we thought to replace the box with a muffin tin for change, that was our first step toward modernization. The curtained closet, the old bureau, and an army footlocker held all our clothing. We were not cursed with possessions. I had only one decorative thing, and even it could be useful. A double brass candle sconce which I had bought in a dark Russian shop under the 2nd Avenue E1 in New York City, hung on our wall, bright against the black paper, near the chintz curtain of the wardrobe. When I sat down to feed my baby, I faced that corner of the room. There was beauty, and after all, one can enjoy the contemplation of only one beautiful thing at a time. Our double bed, that was the complicating factor of our lives. The only possible place for it was in the middle of the room. In the morning, it was made up immediately and pushed out through the double doors onto the apron of the building. The arrangement was adequate unless it should rain. This was the desert. It was not supposed to rain. The shelves above the work table openly displayed our household stock of cans and packages, and the way of the frontier was a general and generous sharing of supplies. When food ran low, neighbors borrowed. People knew we planned to have a store, and our groceries were in plain view. Nothing was more natural that they should buy or borrow of us. Gas station customers had bought our last loaf of bread. I made biscuits, and they were good. But when I was busy with the baby, the middle-sized boy ate too many. His stomach bounced, as he said, all day and all night. I said, "Frank, if we're going to have proper food for ourselves and keep people's goodwill, we will have to open our store." "How can we in this place?" "There is nothing essential in that corner by the door," I pointed out. And so he built 4 5-foot shelves in that corner, and I made a list of groceries for our initial stock, keeping carefully in mind that if no one bought things, we would eat them. A few cases and half cases of tinned meats and vegetables, a few bunches of carrots, cabbage, and potatoes, 2 sides of bacon. The nearest town was Banning, 60 miles away, and 50 of it over the old single-track dirt road. But for wholesale supplies, Frank must go to Riverside, 100 miles distant. A man in a truck could make the round trip in a day if nothing went wrong. Frank left at daybreak, promising to be home in time for the before-supper trade. Sunset came, and gas customers, and I learned to test for oil in a Model T where one crawled halfway under the car. People waited around for a while, hoping for their bread and bacon. They left. I put the children to bed and listened to the coyotes. At last, I put Frank's Army .45 automatic under my pillow and went to bed. It was comforting, something like having a telephone. The automatic made a lump. I moved it under the vacant pillow, but I could not sleep. How come, I asked myself, how come I am lying here in a double garage, away out in the Mojave Desert, with a .45 Colt under a vacant pillow? Perhaps it would help to remember. I remembered that the first thing I had noticed about Frank was the way he rode a bicycle, upright, his head high, his hands barely touching the handlebars. We were both going to the Academy of Willamette University in Salem, Oregon. The State House and the courthouse there have a long, narrow park running several blocks through the center of the city. Willamette University is on one side of the park. My home, a comfortable, welcoming sort of house, was on the other side. I walked across the park to classes, and Frank rode his bicycle there. After our acquaintance had progressed, we used to walk together in the evening under the arching maple trees, and he told me how he happened to ride a bicycle with such style. His first job, when he had gone to work as a messenger boy at 14, had been carrying trays of food from restaurants to public houses through the traffic of the city streets in Spokane. There had been a fitted cap for his head, the trays placed on that. He had never dropped one. Later, he had found work in the hardware store. It paid $25 a month, which was about standard for a boy during the hard times of 1907. He walked the 3 miles to his work, although car fare was 5 cents, and in the winter he often ran because he did not have an overcoat. When he got home, he was expected to wait on and shave his grandfather, who was 100 years old and blind, and who often, by way of conversation, called him by his father's name. "Hottie, do you remember that election in 1875? Who was it that won?" Frank turned his paycheck over to an older sister who managed for the 4 of them on that amount. He told me that although he had always been hungry and often cold, he had thought of it only as being the usual thing. His father once had owned a large wheat ranch with 2 complete harvesting and threshing outfits with the appropriate complement of horses. He had sold out and moved to the city trying to save his wife's life. She had died of cancer when Frank was 12. His father had returned to the area where he was known and tried to establish himself in business, leaving the oldest daughter and one younger than Frank with their grandfather in a borrowed house in Spokane. When Frank was 18, working as a bank clerk, he realized that although he was faster and more accurate than the other boys, who often asked him for help, they would be the ones advanced and he would not. They had college degrees. When after 2 years it became possible to leave the household, he came to Willamette University. Because he was 20 years old, he was rated as a special student and could take work in either the academy or college. Strong, well-coordinated, his bearing quiet but confident, he always found jobs. He was dark with deep-set gray eyes. I thought he was handsome. At 15, I lost all interest in boys my age. That first year, he worked as a night guard at the Oregon State Penitentiary. This left daylight hours for classes, odd minutes for study. In summer, he was assigned to walk the high wall of the brickyard, a rifle always over his shoulder. This was not advancement or what he wanted of life. He bought a volume of poetry, cut out the pages. Folded small, a page could be carried hidden against the butt of his rifle. He memorized well. Now, when we walked on summer evenings, he would quote Shakespeare, Burns, Bryant. So much to remember. I was about to fall asleep there in the garage. I murmured to myself, "To be continued in our next." Then the baby woke. I looked at my clock with a flashlight. It was 2 o'clock. I rose and fed and comforted him. John sat up in bed. "Is Daddy back?" "He will be soon, John. Go to sleep again." Alan mumbled from the other end of the single bed, "Mama, Johnny's touching me." Such little tykes. What had I done bringing them here? 3 o'clock now. Had Frank had an accident on the rough and lonely road? I was wide awake again. Better to go on with my story than to lie there being frightened by imagining. I had been remembering romance. It had led me here, to a garage in the Mojave Desert with 3 small boys. Frank and I had been married 1 month when he brought me his overseas orders. He said, "Smile," and handed them to me to read. He was to report at Hoboken and Embarkation Point on November 14th, 1918. I went along. The day we arrived in New York, the city was wild with joy. The early false report of the armistice had come in. We said the celebration was for us. On the night of the true armistice, the 11th, we had gone to a theater on Broadway. The street had been closed to traffic. It was a solid mass of people walking, shouting, and singing with joy. Police, stolid but smiling, lined the sides of the street, watchful but not interfering. Many in the crowd were men in uniform. They were being greeted as heroes of the peace. Frank and I thought it would be interesting to live in New York for a year or so. When he received notice that he would be discharged, he went to a small bank in Columbus Circle to apply for a job. He went directly to the president of the bank, who was an abrupt, gruff man. He looked Frank up and down. Frank was still in uniform. "Where did you ever work in a bank?" Frank told him the names of the banks in Portland and Salem, Oregon. "What did you do there?" "I was a receiving teller." The president called to the cashier. "Mr. Howe, give this man a job. Put him all through the bank. Give him any salary he wants." Frank soon found out why. There were few in the bank who even looked like bank clerks. Men eligible for military service had enlisted, so Mr. Howe had been managing with girls and ex-policemen. Frank had some difficulty in learning to understand Brooklynese. "Sure, I live at 123rd Street." Frank had started in a teller's cage, but the bank was expanding. He served as manager of a bond department and then a new business department. Life was bright. I was enjoying the city. I explored, found free concerts at odd hours, took long rides on top of buses down Riverside Drive or Fifth Avenue to Washington Square. We lived near Columbia University and I entered classes. That night in the garage, I gratefully recalled that one of my courses had been home nursing. Casually, I wondered if I should have studied typing and bookkeeping. After our son John was born, I had less liberty, but the first day I wheeled him out in his carriage, I met more friendly neighbors than in the 3 years before. But Frank was not well. In Texas, where he had trained and had begun having asthma, he would wheeze desperately at night, but it did not interfere with his work in daytime. When he went to the camp doctor, he was given the routine prescription, castor oil. Few soldiers went back a second time. Now he was worse. He had to be careful not to wheeze at the bank. We had always intended to return to the West. Now, with Frank's problems and a child to think of, we decided to go to California. I thought, how smart we are just to make up our minds where we want to live and go there. So we moved to Pasadena, a beautiful sunny city full of trees and flowers. The vegetation was a curse to Frank. He readily found a job in a bank, but he learned that so many people from the East had come, as we had, for the beauty of the town, that they were not expected to require a living wage. Alan and Denny were born there. We needed to manage on about half the salary Frank had received in New York. At night, before I went to bed, I would arrange the dining table for Frank. I would put out a blanket on a chair, a deck of cards, a magazine. When he could not lie down and breathe, he would get up and go sit there, leaning over, his head on his hands, fighting for air. Often when he dressed for work, I had to kneel and tie his shoes for him. He could not bend down to do it. Then he would go to the bank, stand in a cage all day, trying not to breathe hard, being courteous and efficient. He was unusually accurate in his work and had shown initiative in employee affairs. He was well regarded. Sick though he was, even there, he had found out some outlet for his ability in civic affairs. He had been active in the promotion of the first public golf course in Pasadena, and he had many friends in the American Legion Post 334. It was Ben Benioff, aware of Frank's struggle with asthma, who said, "Frank, I have a little cabin out in the desert. Why don't you come out and try it there?" Frank accepted and spent a month in Ben's one-room shack. The air was healing. He could breathe, and he could sleep. Bill Campbell, homesteading nearby, suggested, "Frank, we need a grocery store in 29 Palms. Why don't you start one?" A grocery store? The fact that Frank did not know spinach from turnips seemed no reason to deter us. We thought anyone could run a grocery store. I must have fallen asleep. For the next thing I knew, it was daylight, and I heard the truck back up on the apron of the garage. We would soon find out, whether just anyone could run a grocery store. We arranged the groceries on our 4 shelves, trying to make an impressive display. Our first customers gave us friendly advice. "Don't you never start cutting a slab of bacon in the middle like folks will ask you to do. Start at one end and let us take it as it comes." We were in business. 2 days later, a boy asked Frank to give him a quart of gasoline to clean a part for his motor. Frank half-filled a can and set it on the ground between them. The boy lit a cigarette and dropped the match. It fell in the opened can. Flames shot up. The boy kicked the can in panic, spraying Frank from head to foot with blazing gasoline. The flames smothered him. He flung himself down, rubbing his face in the sand. He told me afterwards, it felt comforting. A man standing there snatched a blanket from our bed and threw it over Frank, extinguishing the flames. The boy who had kicked the can took off. The man helped me bring Frank into the building, and then he left. I tried to clean the sand from the burns with oil and cotton. Frank's arms and legs had been burned through his clothing. His face was seared and stuck full of coarse sand. We got his clothes half off. He was jittery with shock and sure that anything I could do would be wrong. Fortunately, there appeared in our door a neighbor who had been a pharmacist. He was a shy man, deaf and nearly blind. All that he could see was that Frank was half undressed and that I was on my knees in front of him. "Do come in," I cried. No, thank you," he demurred. "I was just going to get some bread, but I don't wish to intrude." "We need you. Please come in." "Oh, thank you very much," he said politely. "I'll come another day." He turned to go. I jumped up, caught his arm, and pulled him in where he could see. Between us, we dressed the burns. Everyone who came to the gas station that evening offered to help. Everyone except one old man. He was a lean, cadaverous trapper from Tennessee, and he was much annoyed that Frank would not be going to town the next day because Frank had promised to take some skins to an agent for him. I was to recall that incident later. Jim Byler came to haul our water, and he insisted on making the next trip to town. Jim was very proud of his fast driving. He left at dawn, was back at midnight, and the repair bill for the trip was only $39.87. To cheer us, Jim made the boys a gift of 2 pups. They were of mixed but excellent ancestry. Their mother was Jim's fine black collie, their sire an intelligent Irish water spaniel, which belonged to Bill Smith. The pups were black, curly, roly-poly, able to walk and run, but too baby clumsy to turn a corner without falling down. The boys were delighted and loved them at once. Our baby, Denny, was charmed and entertained when they came close and barked at him, and 3-year-old Alan felt that now his life lacked nothing. He could not tell them apart, and he would call excitedly, "Mother, come look! The pup is fighting the other one!" We named them Mike and Ike because, Mike and Ike, they look alike. To celebrate the fact that we were all related in a way, and to show appreciation of their kindness, we invited Jim and Bill for dinner. To my consternation, they arrived at 4:30. The main course was a leg of lamb which Jim had brought from town. That was a very special treat, and dinner could not be hurried. It was quite a party. Frank's face and hands were still done up in boric compresses. He looked as though he had the mumps, and his arms were so stiff and sore he could scarcely manage eating. Jim and Bill wore clean bib overalls and white shirts. They insisted they were entirely comfortable sitting side by side on a sawhorse, but they left immediately after eating. A seat on a sawhorse does not conduce to lingering over coffee and cigarettes. What remained of that leg of lamb would have served us for several days. But sometimes my household arrangements became confused. The next morning, in order to bathe the baby on the kitchen table, I set the pan with the leg of lamb in it under the table. Then there were customers at the gas pump. When I came in, Mike and Ike were so stuffed they could not walk even a straight line without falling down. We entertained Veda Worrell and Ben Benioff with a dinner of jackrabbit cooked in tomato soup. It was Ben who had invited Frank to stay in his cabin and try the effects of the climate. He was a serious young veteran who had graduated from Caltech only to be ordered to the desert to clear up incipient tuberculosis. Veda was a kindergarten teacher recuperating from major surgery. They were good to us, and our children loved them. Veda and Ben were falling in love, and their happiness seemed to create a glow in our dingy room. It was time for more supplies. The bandages were off Frank's face, and he thought that he was able to make the trip. He left in the late afternoon, planning to stay overnight in Riverside. Driving the crooked single-track road to the west with the sun in his eyes, he saw too late a small truck speeding toward him. Just where they would meet, a hump of ground with a big Joshua tree, was on Frank's right. Both trucks turned out the same side of the road. Ours was heavier. The little truck, loaded with baled hay, shuddered to the ground. Both drivers leapt out, unhurt, and walked around surveying the damage. The driver of the pickup was a well-set-up dark man, his dress complete with cartridge belt and gun. He said nothing. Our Franklin truck had a crushed running board. His light truck was a complete wreck. The man with the gun began visibly to bristle. His face flushed beneath the tan. His eyes grew blacker. Frank thought it was time to say something. "I'm Frank Bagley of 29 Palms." "I'm Bill Keyes." Frank pulled his hat down hard. He had the feeling that his hair was about to stand on end. Bill Keyes was known as a man who made his own laws. Rumor had it that there were notches on his gun. He was not a man to be lightly crossed, let alone run into. That old Model T, successor to the Burro in the Mojave, was his transportation, and he lived 20 miles from even that crooked road up the mountainous country. He was growing madder minute by minute as he realized the extent of the damage. His cheeks began to quiver. Frank told himself, "You'd better do something and quick." "Mr. Keyes," he said, "you come here. I have something to show you. Look through my windshield." Keyes came, and through the dirty windshield he could see little but the setting sun's glare. "Now," said Frank, "this is why I couldn't see you, but why in hell didn't you see me?" "You are right, Mr. Bagley," said the man with the gun. "I had my mind on some mining deals. I should have seen you." The Franklin would run. Together the men moved the bales of hay into it, and Frank turned around and drove Bill Keyes to his home. Keyes Ranch lies in the mountains above Rattlesnake Canyon, half hidden among giant boulders. Prospecting with burro and pick, Keyes found something better than gold. He had come by way of Death Valley, a wandering man. He took root like the pinyon pines. He built a dam between boulders which raised the level of the natural reservoir and held water from the winter snows. In a cove, sheltered from the fiercest heat and winds, he built a house, planted an apple orchard, and established a family. In this remote stronghold, Frank was received graciously by a woman with a complexion as delicate as apple blossoms. There were 3 children about the ages of ours. Mrs. Keyes listened to her husband's account of the collision without rancor, accepting his judgment of shared blame. "It's a bad road to travel," she said, "because not many do, and you don't expect to meet another one like yourself." She gave them dinner and made room for Frank to sleep. The next day, the 2 men went to Riverside. Frank told Bill to buy another car as good as the one he'd just wrecked, and he would pay for it because he had been wrong in turning left. Frank put his own truck in a garage. It had suffered more damage than he'd realized. It was second-hand. He had ordered it rebuilt to his design, especially for hauling groceries. Later he learned that it had been put together from 3 wrecked vehicles. It was air-cooled and had a heavy tubular frame, but the rough roads shook it apart. The 3rd day, Frank divided his time between the garage and shopping for our 5 grocery shelves. His arms were paining him, but he ignored the pain. There was too much else to worry about. At day's end, he found Bill Keyes again. "How have you come out?" "Frank, I found another pickup." "Is it satisfactory, and how much was it?" "Oh, yes," said Bill. "It is even a little better than the one I had, but it cost $25. Frank wanted to pay for his hotel room, but Bill refused to accept anything more than the price of the truck. The old truck, he said, had cost $50, but he had driven it 5 years. Late that night, Frank reached home with his load. He was exhausted, wheezing with asthma, and the pain in his arms was intense. Driving in the dark, he had examined them. There was a chain of lumps like beads up the veins inside his elbows and in his armpits, and when he finally opened the garage door, longing for rest, there was not even a place to sleep. While he was away, Veda, who was a guest at the Gold Park Hotel, concerned about me and my problems with babies and business, had come to help me. There had been no message from Frank because there was no phone. When night came and we pushed the double bed inside, she stayed, sharing my bed. Frank said, "Don't get up, Veda. I'll go to the hotel and come back in the morning to unload." It was a fortunate circumstance that sent him there. Frances Roberts, who ran the inn, was a trained nurse. She had only to see Frank to know he was ill. "Oh, my God, Frank," she exclaimed. "You have blood poisoning. You can't stay here tonight. You must go to a doctor at once." Frank knew that he was in no condition to drive back to the city. The nearest doctor was in Banning, 60 miles away. But he had a friend. He went to the home of Bill Campbell and knocked. Bill and his wife Betty came to the door together. Frank told his story and asked Bill if he would take him into Banning. Bill said, "Sure, Frank." Betty broke in, "You will do no such thing. Bill, you draw a warm bath for this man and put him to bed. He must have rest." To Frank she said, "I know something about burns. I nursed after that big ammunition explosion in New Jersey. My husband will take you to the doctor in the morning, but rest must come first." In the morning, Frank was back at our garage store nursery. The truck had been unloaded into the middle of the room. He handed me the bills so I could price the stock. For the trip, they were truck repairs, $59.50, gas and oil, $6.25, pickup for Mr. Keyes, $25, stock for store, $49. Bill Campbell came to get Frank. He looked in and saw Veda, me, and the children surrounded by crates of produce and boxes of cans. I suppose it looked dismal. In the kindest way, he said, "I left a fire on the hearth for my wife. If time hangs heavy on your hands, go down and sit with her." When Minerva Hamilton Hoyt started her crusade to preserve desert landscapes in Southern California in a national park, her first ally was the Garden Club of America. The club was organized nationally in 1913 to exchange information among amateur women gardeners and to pull together support from member state and local garden clubs to protect native plants and birds and to sponsor beautification projects. The club's experiences in protecting the desert and a redwood grove led them into the field of preservation. Unlike the varied goals of the General Federation of Women's Clubs, nearly 20 years older, the Garden Club's mission was from the start limited to environmental concerns. When the Garden Club held its annual meeting in April 1926 in Santa Barbara, California, Eastern members traveled west in their own train, the Garden Club of America Special. Among the 11 railroad cars was an observation car stocked with books about the natural history of California. Their train took the spur to the Grand Canyon, and despite a snowstorm at the rim, several members rode mules down the Bright Angel Trail to the Colorado River and back in one day, noting the changing wildflowers as they progressed from winter at the rim to summer at the bottom. Their first stop in California was Pasadena, where members of the Garden Club vied with one another to show off their gardens. Minerva Hamilton Hoyt soon became the California Club's conservation chair, provided a luncheon in her gardens at her home, Hillcrest. Groves of palm, live oak, and eucalyptus trees, flowering acacias, and bougainvilleas grew in a garden smaller than a city block that had taken 6 months and 20 workers to create. Hoyt was about to launch her campaign to preserve desert plants and would look to the Garden Club for support. Hoyt, called the Apostle of the Cacti for her crusade to protect desert plants, eventually moved beyond the Garden Club's original mission, from the role of gardener who manipulated the environment to create pleasing and even exotic landscapes, to the stance of preservationist who wanted to protect the desert in its natural state. Yet, Hoyt would use the creation of desert gardens as a method to garner support to protect the wildness of the desert. In the late 1890s, when she first arrived in the undeveloped town of Pasadena, newly married to A. Sherman Hoyt, a physician and financier from New York City, she felt the call of the desert. To Hoyt, it was a world of strange and inexpressible beauty, of mystery and singular aloofness, which is yet so filled with peace. Although she was active in building her community, she always found time for the desert, invading it on horseback or on a buckboard. After the death of an infant son and in 1918 of her husband, she turned to the desert for solace. Accompanied by her African-American maid, she slept in the open in a sleeping bag, soothed by the primeval and eerie night wind in the Joshua trees and the pungent odor of the juniper. "The desert possessed me," she said, "and I constantly wished that I might find some way to preserve its natural beauty." Hoyt decided that the only way to convince people that the desert was in as much danger of exploitation as forest lands were was to bring the desert to them. The Garden Club's exhibit space at the 1928 International Flower Show at the Grand Central Palace in New York was her first opportunity. Hoyt used her skill as a gardener to press home her preservation message, employing collectors, taxidermists, and a scene painter to bring cactus, flowers, birds, and animals from the Mojave Desert to life in a naturalized setting. Hoyt sent the materials east in a refrigerator car, supplemented by daily air shipments of desert flowers. After the show, she donated the exhibit to the New York Botanic Garden, a showcase where it would reach the most children. It earned her a gold medal from the Garden Club and supporters for her cause. The following year, the Massachusetts Horticultural Society invited Hoyt to expand her exhibit at their centennial exhibition in Boston. She divided the space into 3 arched areas: a desert habitat, examples of Death Valley's reptiles, animals, plants, insects, rocks, and soil, viewed against a backdrop showing Devil's Golf Course below sea level, with Mount Whitney in the distance, and a redwood exhibit that contained a tree section 1,500 years old, young redwoods, and native plants. For this show, Hoyt used both a refrigerator car and freight car. Airplanes flew in fresh plants twice a day. A few months later, the exhibits were on ships, headed for the Chelsea Spring Flower Show in London, by invitation of the Royal Horticultural Society. Later donated to Kew Gardens, the exhibits caused a sensation in London. The Times headlined its account, "Two Coyotes Have Taken London," and the Royal Horticultural Society gave her their highest honor, the Lawrence Gold Medal. A year later, at the World's Botanic Congress in Cambridge, England, Hoyt announced the formation of the International Deserts Conservation League. Its membership made up of garden club members and botanists. The league was an international society for scientific research, the protection of desert plants, and the establishment of desert parks. Mexico was the first country to respond. President Ortiz Rubino set aside a 10,000-acre cactus forest in the Tehuacan region as a monument to her work, and the National University of Mexico titled her Professor Extraordinary of Botany and arranged a tour of Mexican desert landscapes for her party. But although Hoyt was recognized abroad, her struggle to preserve desert landscapes in the United States would take more time. Hoyt began to focus on a specific area for a national park after Frederick Law Olmsted, Jr., who was surveying potential California parks for the State Commission, chose her to report on desert landscapes. She recommended an area of 1 million acres east of Palm Springs, running between the Salton Sea to the south and 29 Palms to the north. The area encompassed the arid Colorado Desert in the east and the higher, cooler, and wetter Mojave Desert in the west, the habitat of the Joshua tree. Hoyt was particularly anxious to protect the Joshua tree because it had become so popular with plant collectors as a source of lightweight wood. Preferring a national park to one run by the state, she presented her proposal in 1930 to Horace Albright. He turned her down, citing the problem of conflicting land titles and the need to secure Death Valley and Saguaro National Monuments first. With the creation of the two desert parks and the election of President Franklin D. Roosevelt, Hoyt's chances improved. Raised on a Mississippi cotton plantation, Hoyt not only knew the role of hospitality, but as the daughter of a prominent Mississippi Democrat, she also understood the usefulness of connections. Harold Ickes, Secretary of the Interior, supported proposals for parks as a way of combating the Depression and because he knew that Roosevelt favored parks. Hoyt had to move quickly when a bill for a California desert park, including many of the areas she proposed as a national park, passed the California legislature. She convinced Governor James Rolfe, Jr. to veto the bill to give her time to pursue the national park plan. After Rolfe gave her an introduction to Roosevelt, she sat on the White House steps until the president would see her. He summoned Ickes, who told her, "The president is for this, and I am for it." With the aid of the Desert Conservation League members, she prepared 2 volumes of photographs of desert plants and landscapes. Hoyt still had to convince Park Service officials of the value of the park. Roger W. Toll, superintendent of Yellowstone, recommended that protection only be given to the stand of Joshua trees, a reduction from more than 1 million acres to about 140,000 acres. When Hoyt protested, naturalist Harold C. Bryant, who headed research and education for the Park Service, made a field visit. At a reception held at Hillcrest, Bryant announced his support of nearly 800,000 acres of national monument. Land title issues involving unused Southern Pacific Railroad land and California school lands complicated the process. Each problem was solved by land exchanges. When the Park Service suggested that Hoyt buy the Southern Pacific land for the park, she had to refuse. By then, she had used up all her resources in her campaign. Hoyt's dream of a desert park was finally achieved on August 10, 1936, when Roosevelt established Joshua Tree National Monument by proclamation, preserving 825,340 acres. In 1955, 10 years after her death, the Joshua Tree Women's Club placed a plaque honoring her work on a native boulder at Keys View, locally called Inspiration Point, the highest point in the monument, looking across the desert to San Jacinto and San Gorgonio peaks. The plaque quoted her feelings about the desert. "I stood and looked. Everything was peaceful, and it rested me." Joshua Tree lost 1/3 of its acreage in 1950 because of pressure from mining interests, but the efforts of other women 50 years after the monument was first created restored a majority of the withdrawn lands and upgraded Joshua Tree to a national park. Senator Dianne Feinstein of California steered the Desert Protection Act through Congress late in 1994, after it had been blocked in a committee for 7 years. Feinstein built on the work of Judith Anderson, who chaired the first meeting of the Desert Protection League in 1984. Catherine Lacey, legislative aide to Senator Alan Cranston, drafted the original bill in 1986 and provided staff support through to passage. Anderson, a Sierra Club activist, compiled the maps for the entire act and brought 400 letters of support to the 1992 Senate hearing. So I think you'll agree, these ladies were pretty amazing, and I really wanted to share their stories with you. Again, Helen's book is called Sand in My Shoe, and the other book that has Minerva's story in it is called National Parks and the Women's Voice, A History by Polly Welts Kaufman. Both of these can be found online at Amazon or eBay. Also, there's a couple of local bookstores that carry them now and again. One of those is called Raven's Bookshop, which is in 29 Palms on 29 Palms Highway. And the other is called Sagebrush Books, which is also on 29 Palms Highway, but in Yucca Valley. And I'm sure you can find them on our local library shelves here in the desert, whether it's Yucca Valley, 29 Palms, or Joshua Tree. Next week, you'll hear from Hillary Sloan, who left her LA life behind several years ago for the desert, where she's now telling stories through her writing and photography when she's not traveling to Africa. We'll talk about that too. I hope you got some insight and inspiration from these stories today, and if you did, I hope you'll share that with me and the other listeners on the Desert Lady Diaries Facebook page. If you're enjoying this podcast, I hope you'll subscribe or share it with a friend. Thanks so much for listening.